In the winter of 1887, beneath a sky stretched wide as dreams and as cold as the breath of ghosts, a cry rose up from a wooden cabin huddled at the edge of a snow-laced prairie. It was not a cry of joy, nor the shrill triumph of a child breaking into the world. It was quieter than that, thinner, like a whisper torn from the ribs of a woman who had already given too much. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, sweat, and old straw. The fire had long since guttered into coals, and wind slid through the cracks in the boards like a thief. Olivia pressed her back against the splintered wall and clutched her newborn close to her chest. The baby was small, too small, and warm, in that fragile, uncertain way, like a bird's egg still holding life, but barely. Her fingers trembled as she tucked the edge of a woolen shawl tighter around the child's face, her movements slow and aching. She had no strength left to weep, though tears had burned down her cheeks hours ago. Her hair clung in damp strands. To her forehead, the color of pale corn silk gone dark with sweat. Her nightgown was stained with blood and amniotic water, and the cold bit through her bones like metal in deep snow. Still, she looked down at the child and tried to smile. It came out crooked and worn. "She's beautiful," Olivia whispered, as if speaking too loud might shatter the small piece of heaven she held. Her voice was hoarse, nearly drowned in the silence of the room. From the far side of the cabin came a scornful scoff. The mother-in-law, Mary, stiff-backed and sharp-eyed, stood near the stove with her arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. She had not moved to help during the birthing. She had merely watched as though waiting for proof of Olivia's weakness. Her lips curled now, full of disdain. "A girl," she said flatly, as though it were a slur. "Another useless mouth to feed. You were told we needed a boy." Olivia didn't answer. Her arms curled protectively around the baby, whose tiny mouth opened and closed against her breast, seeking milk. Her husband, Thomas, sat on a three-legged stool by the window, his boots still dusted with snow. He had returned only after the labor was nearly done. He hadn't touched the child, hadn't even looked her full in the face. His hands were clasped between his knees, knuckles pale, jaw clenched tight. "I did what I could," Olivia said softly. "She's still your daughter." Thomas's eyes flicked toward her then briefly, with a look that might have once held pity, but now carried only a weary anger. He said nothing. The silence after was worse than a shout. Mary spoke again, voice low and hard. "You've failed. This family. You've cursed this house with another girl. There will be no inheritance now, no legacy, just more crying, more weakness." The fire popped in the hearth, sending a puff of ash drifting into the air like tiny grey moths. Olivia closed her eyes and held her child tighter. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could ache. Her insides felt hollowed out, carved by pain and purpose. She wanted to sleep, but the weight of their judgment pinned her open-eyed. Thomas stood, walked to the door and opened it. Snow hissed in on the wind like a whisper from the grave. He didn't look back. "She can't stay," Mary said. "You know it, and I know it." "She's my wife," he muttered. "She gave you a daughter," Mary replied. "We warned her. This is her doing." Thomas glanced at the child then, just for a second, and something passed over his face. Regret, perhaps, or fear. But it passed quickly, replaced by resignation. She has to leave. Olivia didn't move. At first, she thought she had heard. Wrong? That the pain or the cold or the edge of sleep had muddled her ears. "Leave," she echoed. "You'll take the child and go," Mary said. "You can't stay here." Olivia laughed then, but it was a sound made of disbelief and broken things. "I just gave birth. You're strong enough to argue," Thomas said. "You'll manage." "And go where?" Mary shrugged. "Back east, back to wherever. It is you came from, it doesn't matter." "There's a blizzard outside," Olivia whispered. Thomas said nothing. His hand was already on the doorframe. Mary bent down and placed a parcel beside the threshold, a loaf of bread, half wrapped, in cloth. No butter, no knife. A cruel courtesy. Olivia rose, not by strength but by some inner tether that refused to let her die in their pity. She swaddled the child tighter and fastened her shawl with shaking fingers. The baby stirred, made a soft noise that might have been a cry, might have been a dream. She stepped into the snow. It came up past her ankles, clinging like frostbite. Her boots were worn, her body raw, but she did not look back, not once. If they saw her stumble, they would only use it as proof. She would not give them that. The wind outside wasn't wind at all. It was like a breath drawn in by the earth itself, deep and sorrowful. It tugged at her hair, curled around her ears. She followed the old wagon path east, not because it led to safety, but because it was the only trail not swallowed whole by snow. Her feet sank into the powder, and each step left a hollow mark quickly swallowed by white. Her child, May, yes, she would name her May, for the hope of spring, slept against her chest, unaware of the world's cruelty. Olivia kissed her head, and though her lips were cracked and bleeding, she did not flinch. The sky stretched overhead, ink-black and full of brittle stars. No sound but the crunch of her boots and the cry of the wind. No lantern, no firelight. The moon was her only witness. Hours passed like that, or maybe only minutes. Time frayed at the edges when your body moved only by the pull of necessity. She thought once she heard a coyote in the distance. Once she thought she saw a light, but it blinked out before she could find it again. Her knees gave out near a split-rail fence on the edge of land she didn't recognize. Her vision blurred. She pressed her cheek to the snow and let herself sink, not in surrender but in pause. The child cried, a soft warbling sound. Olivia gathered the baby close again and sang barely more than a hum. It wasn't a lullaby. It was a song her mother once sang while shelling peas by the fire. The air tasted of pine and frost. Her breaths came shallow. She felt herself fading, bone by bone. A shadow passed. Not the wind, not a tree. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunched, in the snow. Olivia lifted her head just barely. A figure knelt before her. Dark hair braided tight, skin the color of warm earth. His coat was fur-lined, his expression unreadable in the pale light. He said nothing. She tried to speak. The words caught in her throat. He reached out, slow like someone not wanting to startle a wild thing, and touched her shoulder. Then everything went quiet. The stars swam, the wind fell away, and the last thing she saw was the curve of his face as he gently gathered her into his arms, the baby swaddled between them, and turned toward the warmth she had not dared to hope still existed. In the world, the wind whispered where her name had been, but someone had heard it, and that was enough for now. The snow hadn't stopped, but it had quieted. It fell now like a hush, a shroud, as though the sky mourned something lost beneath it. Morning came without fanfare, pale light stretching, its fingers across the distant mesas and the skeletons of winter trees. Beneath a low rise of sandstone, where the wind had carved shelter from time, smoke drifted upward in a slender plume. It curled into the dawn, like a prayer without words. Inside the earth-warmed dwelling, the fire spoke in small crackles. Its breath filled the space with the scent of cedar and ash. On a woven mat, Olivia lay wrapped in soft buffalo hide, her body still, her breath shallow. Her hair was damp, tangled, her cheeks flushed with fever. The baby stirred faintly beside her, swaddled in thick cloth lined with rabbit fur, no longer crying but sleeping, as if she understood that sound would cost more than it gave. Atsamu watched them from the far side of the room. He sat cross-legged, his eyes dark and calm, as if carved from quiet. His face bore the stories of wind and stone, cheekbones high, brows drawn gently together, lips pressed in a line that wasn't frowning, but wasn't smiling either. His braid fell over one shoulder, thick and black as a raven's wing. He didn't move for a long while. Just listened to the fire and the breath of strangers, now sleeping under his roof. He hadn't meant to find her. The spirits didn't warn or whisper. They simply led. He'd ridden out at dusk to check the southern traps, something he did by rhythm more than need, and spotted the strange marks in the snow. Not wagon wheels, not coyote. Small footsteps, erratic, sagging deeper and deeper into the drift. His horse had caught scent of milk on the air, a scent too soft for the wild. He followed, heart steady, eyes wary, and there she had been, curled near the boundary line of their land, crumpled like broken wings, with a child clutched to her. Breast and her lips blue as dusk. He hadn't hesitated. There were no questions, only the knowing that life must be protected when it clings to the edge of itself. Now, inside the warm hollow of his home, he moved. Carefully, slowly. He placed a bowl of herb-steeped water near her side. It steamed gently, earthy and sharp with wild chamomile, aspen bark and juniper. He checked the fever with the back of his hand, still hot, but not worse. That was something. He did not wake her. Healing, he had learned, came first in stillness. He turned back to his place, to the carving he'd left half done before dawn, and let the fire speak between them. Olivia woke hours later, not all at once but in pieces. The warmth touched her first, then the smell. Smoke and something green, something real. Her eyes opened slowly, heavy-lidded, and met the strange room with confusion. She did not recognize the woven mats, the curved walls of clay and bark, the shadows that danced like old memories. Her first instinct was fear. Then she saw the baby lying beside her, wrapped tight in a cloth finer than she'd ever sewn herself. She reached out, touched the child's cheek. Warm. Alive. Olivia breathed for the first time in what felt like 100 winters. A shadow moved. Her head snapped up and she saw him. The man, quiet, still seated at the edge of the room, not reaching for her, not speaking, just watching, not with suspicion or hunger or pity, but something stranger, a kind of steadiness. She tried to sit, up. Pain bloomed sharp in her side and she winced. "You shouldn't move," he said, his voice low, deep as riverstone. It was the first time she heard him speak. The sound startled her, not because of what was said, but how it was said. Like he was answering a question she hadn't known, she asked. Her throat caught. "Where am I?" He didn't rush to reply. Words came when they mattered. "In shelter." She nodded slowly, her mind swimming between gratitude and worry. "My baby?" He looked toward the child, nodded once. "Safe." Olivia closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her temple and vanished into the blanket. She didn't try to explain, didn't thank him. She was too tired, and some kinds of thankfulness couldn't be spoken aloud without crumbling into sobs. The man stood then and left the room. She tensed, but when he returned it was only with a carved bowl of broth, steam curling from its rim like a spirit rising. He set it down gently beside her and stepped back. No words, no pressure. Olivia took it in shaking hands, sipped. The warmth spread through her like morning light, slow and welcome. Her eyes fluttered closed. Days passed, not counted by clocks, but by firewood burned and bowls emptied. Atsumu never asked her name nor where she came from. He simply existed near her like a steady drumbeat, never too close, never gone too long. When he left, he brought back water, dried fish, herbs. When she cried silently in the night, he didn't interrupt. But the next morning he left a small carved figure near her bed, a woman holding a child. No words attached, just the gift. She learned to trust his silence. In time she told him her name. Olivia. He nodded once, folded the name into his understanding of her without changing his expression. She watched him when he worked. His hands, wide and sure, smoothed wood and hide like he was coaxing breath from them. He sang sometimes, soft melodies in a language she didn't know but felt. They rose like wind through canyon walls, carried grief and memory inside them. He watched the baby too. May. Olivia had told him the name late one night when the fire was low and her voice felt safe. He had not smiled, but his eyes softened. "She will have strong hands," he said once while May kicked at the blanket. Olivia blinked. "Why do you say that?" He shrugged slightly. "Her mother holds the world, like it will not break her." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. Her body healed slowly. The ache in her side dulled, and her strength returned like light through thinning clouds. She could walk now, though not far. She washed the baby with water warmed by the hearth. She began helping in small ways, grinding herbs, folding cloth, sewing patches. Hatsumu never asked her to, but never stopped her either. They moved around each other like two branches swaying in the same wind, never colliding. Still, silence could not last forever. One afternoon, as she strung a length of sinew through a torn hem, she looked up. "You don't want to know where I came from." Atsamu was tending the fire, back turned. He stirred it once, twice, then sat beside it. "You will tell me," he said, "if it matters." She laughed softly, not cruelly. "Just tired. It matters, I just don't know how to make it small enough for words." He looked at her, not blinking. "Then don't make it small." Olivia sat very still. Then she spoke. She told him about the cabin, the birth, the cold voices, the bread left at the door. She did not cry as she spoke, but her voice wavered like a leaf trying to stay on a tree in winter. She told him how they'd named her failure, how they'd looked at May like a burden wrapped in flesh. Atsamu didn't interrupt. He listened like men rarely did, without fixing, without judging, just listened. When she finished, the fire had burned low. "I thought I would die," she said, "but part of me already had." "You are not dead." "No," she said, "but I don't know what I am now." He reached over and placed a smooth river stone in her palm, warm from the fire. "You are becoming." The simplicity of it nearly unraveled her. That night, Olivia held May close and sang to her. Not the songs from her mother, but one she'd made up herself, about wind and fire and a man with eyes like deep soil. Atsamu sat just outside the room, sharpening a blade. But she knew he heard. The snow began to melt, slowly, reluctantly. But it melted. Patches of earth emerged like wounds healing over. Trees budded in secret. Birds returned. Olivia walked farther each day. Her legs no longer shook. Her voice no longer cracked when she spoke. She began to hum as she worked. She carved her own figure from wood, awkward and simple, but hers. May grew, eyes bright, voice louder. Atsamu taught her to hold her head high, even when she wobbled. He called her Little Hawk. She giggled at the sound. Olivia watched them, heart full and unsure. She still didn't know what name to give the space they all shared. Not home, not yet. But maybe shelter, maybe fire. One. Evening, as the stars bloomed above the canyon like scattered seeds, Olivia stood outside with May bundled in her arms. Atsamu came beside them, quiet as always. She looked up at him. "Do you believe in second lives?" He tilted his head. "Not second, just continued." She nodded, holding the words like a quilt, and in that moment, with the stars above and the fire waiting behind them, she understood something she hadn't before, that love didn't have to arrive loudly to be real. It could come like snow, like steam, like silence shared between two people who had both been broken and chose not to break each other again. She didn't reach for his hand, but she didn't need to. The fire had already done its work. The thaw came slowly. It didn't announce itself with trumpets or warm winds, but with quiet things, the soft drip of melting icicles, the sudden chatter of birds returning to bare branches, the way the earth no longer cracked underfoot but yielded, damp and forgiving. In the hush between winter and spring, Olivia found herself changed. She had stopped counting the days. Life had begun to move not in numbers but in rhythms. May's waking cries, the morning tendings of the fire, the pulse of footsteps shared in the same narrow space. Where once she measured survival in distance and pain, she now measured it in presence. In the feel of May's small fingers clutching her braid, in the warmth of Atsamu's coat hanging beside her shawl. They lived as two threads wound through the same cloth, separate yet always crossing. Olivia spent her mornings by the fire now, sewing. She had found a bundle of worn fabric in a chest. By the wall, wrapped carefully in oilskin, remnants of clothes long outgrown. From those she began to piece together a shawl, not just for warmth, but for remembering. Each patch she stitched told a story. The corner of a child's blanket, a sleeve torn by time, a faded strip of blue with tiny stars on it. When she worked, her hands were calm. She could almost forget the echo of those final words spoken in the cold. "You've given us nothing." She had given life, twice. Once to the child who now giggled at pine cones and chased shadows, and again to herself, though that one had taken longer to cry out. Atsamu watched her sometimes not intrusively, but with that steady, listening stillness of his. He would sit with his tools or tend the fire, and she could feel his presence like one feels sunlight through closed eyes. She didn't need him to say much. She had learned by now how to hear what he didn't speak. When she asked about the loom that stood in the corner of the room, half wrapped in hide, he told her it had belonged to his sister. She wove songs into cloth, he said. Olivia smiled. At that. What kind of songs? He shrugged. Ones you couldn't hear, but you could feel them. In the way the fabric moved in wind, in how the colors danced. Did she pass? He nodded once. The same year I returned from war. Olivia didn't ask what war. She could see it in the way he sometimes stared into the fire as if expecting. Fair to answer back. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but something gentler. She would have liked you. That night, Olivia dreamed of a woman with hands stained in indigo, humming as she wove threads of gold into a sky-colored shawl. She awoke with the image still bright behind her eyes, and an ache in her chest that was not grief, but longing. The days warmed. Atsamu began taking May with him to the edge of the woods while he foraged. Olivia would watch them from the doorway, the child bobbing beside him like a lantern. May never cried when he carried her. She would nestle against his back, arms spread, like wings. Olivia once caught her humming the tune she always sang at bedtime, and it brought tears to her eyes for reasons she couldn't name. She baked bread again, with crushed cornmeal and wild seeds Atsamu traded for. The smell filled the small home with something that felt like history rewritten, this time without the sharpness of rejection. She remembered the first loaf Mary had left by the door, how it had felt like a mockery. Now, bread was no longer charity. It was offering. Sometimes they spoke about things without naming them. Sitting at the fire one evening, Olivia mentioned the prairie beyond the river. It's blooming, she said. I saw purple flowers yesterday. Atsamu nodded. Spring comes slower here, but it comes. She looked into the fire. There was a tree in my old home. Pear blossom. Always bloomed early. My husband cut it down, said it made a mess. He didn't respond. But he tossed another log on the fire, and the light grew. Another time, as she was brushing May's hair with the carved comb he had given her, Olivia asked, Do you ever think of leaving here? He took his time before answering. No. Not anymore. Why? This land knows me, and I know it. It remembers even when I don't. That answer stayed with her. She wondered if land could remember people the same way people remembered pain. Could it hold them gently, offer them back to themselves? They began eating together now, no longer on separate sides of the room. At first it had been necessity, sharing warmth, passing bowls, but it had shifted, subtly, into ritual. She would set down 3 wooden spoons, and he would pass her the stew pot as if this arrangement had always existed. May would reach for both of them with sticky fingers, babbling in a language only she knew. The tension that had once lived beneath their skin had loosened. Olivia found herself leaning into the silence, not away from it. She no longer needed to fill it with stories. It was enough to be near. To share space with someone who didn't require masks. One afternoon, as the sun spilled across the floor in golden squares, Olivia brought out the shawl she had been sewing and laid it across her lap. Atsamu watched her from where he was carving. A spoon for May. I think I want to finish it, she said. He nodded. You should. But I don't want to just patch memories into it. I want to weave something forward. He stood then, walked to the back corner of the room and lifted the hide from the loom. He brought it to her carefully, the way someone carries old bone or sacred soil. Then begin here. Her hands trembled as she touched the frame. Not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. She had woven before, but always for duty, for warmth, never for voice. She set the first threads. May toddled to her side and clapped. Atsamu watched with his quiet approval, and in that moment something shifted, not just in the room, but in her. She was not just surviving now, she was creating. That evening, she stepped outside for air. The moon hung low and bright, and the air smelled of crushed grass and wet bark. Atsamu followed after a while, standing a short distance away. She turned to him. "You've given us a home, but I've never asked, is there room for more than that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out a small bundle. He opened it and revealed a bead of turquoise, smooth and cool as river light. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She wore it when she crossed into this land. It was all she had left from her own." Olivia stepped closer. "Why are you showing me this?" He placed it in her hand. "Because it should be sewn into something new." She looked at the bead, then at him. Her heart was steady, her breath soft, and for the first time she did not feel like she was asking for something she did not deserve. That night, she stitched the turquoise bead into the center of her weaving, between the old cloth and the new thread, between memory and hope. She did not sleep much, but she did not need to. And when the dawn came, pale and gold and filled with birdsong, she understood what had been made between them. Not a vow, not a declaration. Something quieter, something that would last, like thread wound through cloth. Like stories told without needing to be explained. The days grew longer, and the wind no longer bit through flesh. It whispered now, softer, coaxing the earth awake, stirring green from the roots of stubborn things. Olivia stood outside the dwelling. That had become her shelter, and watched May chase a blue-winged butterfly through the garden she had planted with her own 2 hands. Beans climbed poles. Squash bloomed yellow. The sun was warm on her face. She felt it not as an outsider, but as one meant to be there, finally tethered to something that wouldn't abandon her when the snow came again. She was no longer the woman who had walked barefoot into the storm. That woman had bled in silence, had waited for doors to open that never would. This woman, this Olivia, carried quiet strength beneath her skin. Not loud, not proud, but steady. She had built her peace with thread and fire, laughter and lullabies, not because it was offered, but because she chose it every single morning she woke up and stayed. Atsamu worked near the edge of the field, mending a broken fence rail. His movements were slow, deliberate. He spoke little as ever, but she could read him now the way one reads a sky before rain. When his shoulders hunched, he was worried. When he paused mid-swing of the hammer, he was thinking. When he glanced toward her and lingered, it meant something he couldn't say was blooming beneath his ribs. They didn't talk of love, not the way others did. There were no promises made aloud, no rings, no scripted vows. But each evening, when he passed her the cup before himself, when he held May as if she were carved from starlight, when he added more wood to the fire than they strictly needed, that was enough. And yet, the world beyond them had not forgotten. It came first as a shadow at the edge of the trail. Then a boot print, foreign and pressed too deep into the soft spring soil. Atsamu found it while gathering pine resin near the creek. He said nothing for a time, simply watched the trees longer than usual and listened more closely to the wind. Olivia noticed the change. His gaze grew tighter, his hands slower. She asked once, "Are you troubled?" He replied, "Not yet." But the unease lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. It settled in her bones. She found herself listening too, heart catching at unfamiliar sounds, the groan of saddle leather, the clink of metal on rock. The quiet had become sacred to her. Any fracture in it felt like a threat. And then the letter came. A young boy, Navajo, but from another family 2 valleys away, arrived on horseback. He bore no weapon, only a sealed parchment, handed with wide, unsure eyes. "It's from them," he said, nodding toward the hills. "White folks, near the trading post, said it was meant for a Mrs. Olivia Hart." Her fingers curled before they reached for the envelope. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in months. Her heartbeat sounded like a drum made of wet hide. She opened it slowly, read it once, read it again. Thomas was remarried. Mary had taken ill. The house was in disarray. And though no apology was written, only the brittle language of obligation, they had written these words. "You may return. We will take the child if you no longer wish to raise her on savage land." The paper shook in her hand. Her stomach curled. Like burning paper. Her name written in ink by hands that never deserved to hold it. Her child, the child, reduced to an inconvenience, a mark against their pride. They had cast her out into the snow, and now they wanted to reclaim what they never valued, only because their world was crumbling without her. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She burned the letter, not with a shout, not with ceremony, just quiet purpose. One corner at a time, letting the flames chew through every brittle lie, every ounce of control they tried to reach across miles to reclaim. Atsamu stood beside her, saying nothing. When the last curl of ash drifted into the wind, she looked at him. They never knew her name, he nodded. That is their poverty. Days passed. Spring deepened. May grew bolder, faster. Her steps no longer stumbled. Her eyes lit with curiosity and laughter. Olivia taught her how to water the roots gently, how to whisper to the leaves. Atsamu carved her a whistle in the shape of a bird. She carried it always like a talisman. They lived, not in hiding but in the open, not loudly but fully, until the rider came. It was evening. The fire had just been lit. Olivia was braiding May's hair, humming a song she barely remembered. Learning. Atsamu stood outside, sharpening his blade, the wind threading through his braid. Then came the sound, hooves, fast, not cautious. By the time Olivia stepped outside, the rider had dismounted. A man, pale-skinned, long coat, boots scuffed from travel. His eyes searched the homestead with the kind of practiced ownership that made her breath catch. "You the one called Olivia Hart?" he asked, voice drawling and low. She said nothing. Atsamu stepped forward, hands at his side, calm as stone. "You are not welcome here." The man looked him over with thinly veiled disdain. "I don't reckon that's yours to decide." "Every land is someone's," Atsamu said, "and you do not belong to this one." The man took a folded letter from his coat. "I'm here on behalf of Thomas Hart, your former husband. Claims his wife's gone astray. Wants the girl returned. Olivia's." Hart didn't race. It stilled. "She's not his to claim," she said. The man smirked. "Blood's blood." "No," she said, stepping forward, voice clear. "A father's more than seed. A mother's more than womb. You want to speak of rights? Then ask who fed her when she was cold, who held her through fever, who taught her her first word, her first step, who stitched her clothes, who sang her to sleep. She was born in his house," the man said flatly. "She was born into the snow," Olivia said, eyes hard, "and I carried her out of it." A silence hung in the air like a held breath. Atsamu didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stance said everything. "You will not take what isn't yours." The man's hand went to his hip, just touching the handle of his pistol, but Olivia did not move, and neither did Atsamu. Not fearfully, not rashly, just standing. In that moment, the writer saw something he hadn't expected. Conviction. Not loud, not angry, but ancient and deep like canyon stone. And a woman who would not kneel, and a man who would not flinch. He let out a breath. "Well," he muttered, "guess the world's changed some." He tucked the letter back into his coat, mounted his horse, spat into the dirt. "She ain't worth the ride back anyway." He left. Dust and hoofbeats swallowed his form. The wind carried away the sound. Olivia stood very still. Her hands trembled just slightly. Then she felt Atsamu's hand at her back, not pushing, not pulling, just there. She turned and walked inside. That night, they didn't speak of what had happened. There was no need. May slept curled beside the fire, whistle clutched in her tiny fist. Olivia sat with her weaving, added a new thread, deep red, like firelight. She didn't name it aloud, but she knew what it meant. Courage. Atsamu handed her her strip of leather. "For the edge," he said. She smiled, took it. Their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. Later, when the stars had risen and the fire was cold, she looked at him. "Do you think a place can have a name, even if it's never written down?" "Yes." "What would you call this one?" He met her eyes, the longest he ever had. "Hope," he said, and she believed him. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she carried May on her hip and stepped outside. The sky was gold and pink, the garden alive with promise. She placed a small wooden marker in the soil, carved with her own hands. It read, "Home." Behind her, Atsamu stepped out, silent, steady. He placed his hand on her shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, and when they turned to go back inside, the door did not close behind them. It stayed open, letting in the light. In the winter of 1883, under a sky wide as dreams and just as unreachable, snow fell in slow, deliberate silence. It wrapped itself around the town of Willow's Rest, like a shawl worn thin by sorrow, clinging to wooden eaves and whispering through the bare bones of cottonwoods. The wind knew everyone's name here. It had a way of getting inside even the tightest seams, murmuring old regrets beneath the doors of lonely hearts. At the edge of the churchyard, just beneath the steeple's watchful cross, sat a woman in white. The dress she wore had once been chosen with trembling fingers and high hopes, a lace-laden thing with pearl buttons and embroidery that followed the line of roses in bloom. Now it lay quiet on her lap, heavy with frost and folded dreams. Her wheelchair creaked as the wind nudged it gently, as if unsure whether to carry her forward or leave her be. Clara Bell was still, save for her hands. One rested atop the other in her lap. Pale fingers curled slightly, as if remembering how to hold something precious. Her eyes, the color of overcast dawn, stared past the snow into a world that had promised much and delivered little. She did not cry, not the way others might have. Her sorrow had a quieter tongue. It was the kind that stitched itself into silence and waited for spring. The church door had closed more than an hour ago. It was still ajar enough for the warmth and voices to seep out, but no one had come to find her. The guests had gone. The man had gone. There had been whispers when he first arrived, something about how he hadn't expected her condition to be visible, as though her wheels betrayed something shameful rather than something survived. He had seen her, in the doorway, with her veil fluttering like a tired flag, and he had turned, just like that. The horse's hooves had beaten a retreat across the frost-packed road, leaving Clara in a snowfall that muffled every sound except the quiet war inside her chest. She remained there, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she didn't know how to move when everything inside her had already stopped. Around her, the world kept shifting. Wood creaked, sparrows lifted and darted, and far off, a cow lowed from some distant field. But inside her, time had curled into a ball and refused to stretch. The dress she wore had belonged to her mother. It smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar. She'd kept it in a trunk with polished brass handles, along with letters from a man who never returned from the war. Clara had opened that trunk last month and touched every inch of the gown with reverence, imagining how it might feel to be wanted, not as a burden or a charity, but as something deeply known and still chosen. It was not the first time she had believed in something fragile. She'd believed once that if you were kind enough, strong enough, useful enough, someone might see past the wheels and into the person still standing inside them. But belief has a price, and Clara had spent hers. In silence. The town of Willow's Rest was not cruel exactly, but it was the kind of place that looked away when things became too complicated. Clara had lived here for 3 years now, ever since her brother's family moved further west in search of richer soil. She'd refused to go with them, said she had her own roots now. Truth was, she hadn't wanted to be a burden. She rented a room above the general store and worked as a seamstress. Her hands had learned to listen, to coax beauty from torn sleeves and worn boots. She traded her skill for eggs and coffee grounds, and the occasional apple pie from Mrs. Goodwin, who ran the apothecary and had a heart big enough to keep stray cats and lonely women alike. Clara had stitched her own veil, each thread sewn with patience and trembling hope. She hadn't expected grandeur, just a little warmth, a little truth. The man who had written to her, his name was Daniel, had seemed proper. His letters were neat, respectful. He spoke of needing a wife to help tend his land, of wanting children. She hadn't told him about her legs, not because she meant to deceive him, but because she wanted to be heard first, seen with words before seen with eyes. But now he had seen, and it had been enough to undo everything. Snow began to gather in her lap, delicate and cold, like tiny apologies falling from heaven. Clara blinked slowly. Her breath came out in soft clouds. She looked at her hands again and thought of her mother's favorite hymn. She hummed it faintly, voice rough with the kind of sadness that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. A child's laughter, high and sudden, broke through the hush. It startled her, not the sound itself, but the fact that it was so alive. She turned her head slightly, neck stiff from the stillness, and glimpsed a small figure in a red wool coat darting through the snow just past the row of churchyard pines. The boy couldn't have been more than 7. His steps were joyful, unburdened. He was chasing something unseen, his boots kicking up powder as he ran in circles. A twig horse, maybe, or some imaginary creature only children can conjure in bleak winters. Clara watched him, something tender and aching flickering in her chest. Then a man emerged from between the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark wool coat dusted in white. He called out softly to the boy, his voice a low rumble, and the child ran toward him with the same wild joy. The man knelt, scooped the boy into his arms, and turned. For a moment, his eyes met Clara's. There was no pity in them, no startle, no awkward turn away, just a steady, considering look, as if he'd already known she would be there sitting quietly with a wedding veil and snowflakes in her lap. Then he tipped his hat to her. Just a small gesture, nothing dramatic, but it landed in her like the first crack of ice on a thawing river. He walked away, boy on his hip, boots crunching against snow. Clara didn't realize she was holding her breath until the air around her stilled again. A bell rang out in the distance, marking the noon hour. Church doors opened. A few latecomers spilled out, blinking into the brightness. No one looked her way. She shifted slightly in her chair, the motion stiff and slow, her fingers brushing the lace at her sleeves as if trying to remind herself she was still there. Mrs. Goodwin approached, her shawl pulled tight and breath pluming in the air. "Oh, Clara, child," she said softly, voice cracking like old parchment. "You've been out here too long. Come inside now, there's broth warming on the stove. You'll catch cold." Clara didn't answer, but let herself be wheeled gently down the wooden ramp and toward the road. Her veil trailed behind her, catching a final gust of wind before settling. As they moved away, she looked once more toward the trees. They were empty now. The boy and the man were gone. But the snow had been marked. 2 sets of footprints leading away in parallel, cutting clear through the white. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed, dress folded at the foot, and stared at the ceiling. The wind played with the eaves again, and in the walls the old boards shifted with memory. She wondered about the boy, about the man. She wondered if either of them had thought of her since, but mostly she wondered if it was foolish to hope again, even a little. And then, as sleep gently took her hand, she thought she heard that child's laughter again, soft, far away, but real. Not a memory, not a dream, just a sound that stayed with her through the night, curling close like warmth inside cold linen. And perhaps, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely forgotten. You said, construct section 2. The house with the willow tree porch, with a clear, focused narrative that introduces the main characters and central conflict. Use a diverse vocabulary, and ensure each sentence contributes to advancing the plot or deepening character understanding. Section should be of exact 2,000 words, and avoid introducing any elements that do not serve the story's immediate needs. Structure the section to have a satisfying end, yet encourages continued reading, ensure character development, and there should be no headings. Answer in ChatGPT said, the days after the wedding that wasn't passed, like clouds across a pale sky, soft, slow, and nearly silent. Snow came again, not in a fury, but in quiet drifts that gathered like forgotten prayers on rooftops and window ledges. Clara Bell resumed her life with the steadiness of someone who had no other choice. She worked. She folded fabric and threaded needles. She soaked linens and counted out tea leaves by weight and by need. No one asked her about the church steps. No one mentioned the dress, nor the way she'd sat for hours in the cold with only snowfall for company. Willow's Rest wasn't unkind, just careful with its discomforts. People nodded to her as always. Children still ran by her wheels, trailing laughter and mud. Mrs. Goodwin still saved the ripest pears and the softest cheese ends for her. But there was a hush now when Clara passed, like folks didn't know what to do with the remnants of a dream they hadn't been invited to witness. Yet time moved. It always did. The willow tree porch stood at the far edge of town, past the river bend, where the road turned narrow and the fences leaned inward like they were tired of standing alone. The house behind that porch was broad and dark-roofed, with windows that watched the world like eyes half shut from grief. There were no flowers along its path, not this time of year. Only the weeping branches that brushed the earth like mourning. Veils. It was there that Elias Hartwell lived, with his young son and the ghost of a woman whose name was never spoken in the market, but who lingered in the hush of his eyes. Elias had not been born into wealth, but he had earned it with calloused hands and quiet endurance. His land stretched across hills soft with grazing and woods thick with timber, but he carried none of that fortune on his shoulders. He wore plain coats and mended his own boots. His wealth lay beneath the surface, like springs that ran deep and cold, unseen until you drank from them. He had loved once, deeply, the kind of love that doesn't fade, only shifts into another shape when the one it lived for is gone. His wife had died 3 winters back, the illness slow and the silence slower. Since then, Elias had been a man of function. He rose before dawn, worked until the light faded, tucked his son into bed with a kiss that carried both love and apology. Then he sat in his chair by the hearth and listened to the fire crackle like it might speak her name if he waited long enough. He'd noticed Clara long before the wedding dress. She passed by his land every week, her wheels leaving a twin path on the dirt road, steady and unhurried. She often carried a basket of mended garments or herbs, her face tilted slightly to the wind like she was reading something only she could understand. He didn't stare, just watched, quietly, respectfully, the way a man watches a hawk cross the sky and wonders what it sees that he cannot. His boy, Tommy, was 7 and full of shadows and sparks. He had his mother's eyes and his father's silence. He rarely spoke to anyone outside their home, but he drew constantly. Chalk sketches on scrap paper, animals and stars, and sometimes people he'd seen just once. He was a child who listened to trees and talked to fences. He didn't cry much, not since the funeral, but his laughter, when it came, burst out like a creek breaking free from winter's grip. The day Clara had sat outside the church, Tommy had seen her first. Elias had followed, uneasy about the boy's sudden dash toward the snow, and then he'd seen her too, alone in white, with eyes that looked too still for someone so young. He'd tipped his hat because anything else felt too large, too sharp. A bow would have been pity, a word, an intrusion. But a tip, simple, respectful, was something he could give without taking anything from her. Since then she had haunted his thoughts the way music does after a long dance. Not loud, not constant, but echoing. 1 week later, the moment came. It was a Tuesday morning, sun slanting low through thin clouds, when Elias walked into Clara's little shop. She'd opened it behind the general store, just a small room with bolts of fabric and a cast-iron stove, her wheelchair nestled behind a table strewn with spools and thread. There was warmth in the air, the kind that came from work well done and quiet persistence. Clara looked up, startled but composed, her hands folded in her lap. "Mornin'," Elias said, voice low and rough as worn leather. "I've a coat, needs mending." He held it out. She took it without hesitation, her fingers brushing the wool, noting the tear near the shoulder seam. "Simple stitch," she murmured. "Can have it by Thursday." He nodded, started to leave, then paused. "My boy." He draws. "Saw you that day. Asked if angels came in chairs." Clara didn't smile, but something behind her eyes softened. "I'm no angel," she said, voice a hush of thread and wind. Elias nodded. "Didn't think so. Angels leave too soon." He walked out then, coatless, the air biting at his arms. Behind him, Clara stared at the thread she'd just picked up, letting it fall from her hand. The next time it was Tommy who arrived, slipped in without knocking, holding out a crumpled page with a drawing on it. Clara, seated beneath a tree, Her hands folded, a small sun overhead and birds flying. No words, just the drawing. He handed it to her and ran off before she could speak, and so began something not quite a courtship, but not entirely not. Elias came again the following week, this time with a hat that had lost its band, then a shirt with missing buttons, always. Polite, never lingering too long, but Clara noticed how his eyes watched her hands, not her wheels, how his voice lowered when he asked after her work, how he listened like her answers mattered. Tommy came too, sometimes with drawings, sometimes with questions. He never called her anything at first, just looked at her like she was a story half told, and he meant to finish it. Clara found herself saving scraps of fabric in case he stopped by, teaching him the feel of good wool, how to knot a thread without breaking it. Slowly the air around her shifted. People still spoke in whispers when she passed, but Elias spoke to her in a steady, grounded way that steadied her own breath. Tommy's laughter became a sound she started waiting for. One late afternoon, Elias lingered. The sun was a red smear across the horizon, and Clara was closing her shutters when she saw him outside. "Trouble with the wagon," he said. "Axle cracked." She nodded toward the stove. "There's tea left." He stepped inside, boots leaving a trail of slush. Sat near the fire, silent. She poured 2 cups. The room smelled of peppermint and pine. They didn't speak for a while, just drank. The warmth settled between them like a wool blanket. Then Elias said, "She liked tea too, my wife." Clara looked at the fire. "I'm sorry. She's been gone a while now. Tommy still waits for her sometimes. He doesn't say it. But I see." Him watching the door. Clara didn't offer comfort, just sat with him in it. That was enough. "She was strong," Elias said after a moment, laughed with her whole mouth, sang to the cattle. "I can't sing," Clara whispered. Elias looked at her. "You don't have to." A silence bloomed. Comfortable. Then he rose, nodding. "Thanks for the tea." Clara watched him go, the door closing soft behind him. A week passed. Snow melted slowly. The air grew heavier, not quite spring, not quite winter. Clara received a parcel from Mrs. Goodwin. Ribbons for Tommy's drawings. She tucked them into a small box and waited for his next visit. One evening there was a knock. Not Elias. Tommy stood there, coat askew, hair windswept. "Papa's sick," he said, voice tight. He fell, hurt his leg, won't go to town. Without hesitation, Clara grabbed her shawl. It took time to hitch the mule and cart, but she managed. She had never been to the Hartwell house before. Tommy guided her through the trees, past the fences and frozen creek, to the porch where willow branches brushed the boards like gentle fingers. Elias lay inside, pale but alert. His ankle was swollen, badly twisted but not broken. Clara set to work, making tea, fetching towels, binding the injury with firm, practiced hands. She'd learned much from her mother and from solitude. Elias didn't protest, just watched her with something unreadable in his gaze. "You came," he said softly. "You needed someone," she answered. He looked toward his son, who now sat. "Near the fire, content and warm, I think," Elias murmured. "He needs you too." Clara didn't answer, just squeezed his hand once firmly. That night she stayed until the fire burned low. Tommy slept in her lap for a while, then beside his father. Elias drifted off with her hum in the air, not quite a lullaby, not quite a hymn. When she left, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear, stars sharp as cut glass. The willow branches above her did not mourn that night. They moved with the wind like dancers waking from long sleep. She returned home exhausted but filled with something steady. Not joy, not yet, but the start of belonging. Outside her window, a child's drawing fluttered in the wind. It showed a woman in a chair beside a house with a tree that wept. But in the sky above them both, a new sun was rising. You said, "Construct." Section 3. Bread rising in the oven, and something in her heart, too, with a clear, focused narrative that introduces the main characters and central conflict. Use a diverse vocabulary and ensure each sentence contributes to advancing the plot or deepening character understanding. Section should be of exact 1,500 words, and avoid introducing any elements that do not serve the story's immediate needs. Structure the section to have a satisfying end, yet encourages continued reading. Ensure character development, and there should be no headings. Answer in ChatGPT said, the days lengthened just barely as February melted into March. Morning frost still clung to the fence posts like stubborn ghosts, but the sun lingered longer in the sky, reluctant now to say goodbye so quickly. In Clara's little shop, beside the stove that always ticked with warmth, the scent of rising bread curled through the air, yeast and flour and soft, hopeful things. She had begun baking again, not for profit, not out of need, but because her hands wanted to make something that rose, even when the world had once told her she could not. The act soothed her, flour dusting her skirts like snowfall, dough soft beneath her palms. Her wheelchair squeaked now and then as she rolled from one table to the next, but she had grown into the rhythm of it. No part of her ached to walk. She ached to be seen. And slowly she was. Elias came more often now, not with coats to mend or broken buttons, but simply with presence. He would bring Tommy some afternoons, and the boy would sit cross-legged on the floor, sketching horses with wings or trees that held lanterns in their branches. Elias would sit near the stove, sipping Clara's tea, and they'd talk in low tones about the weather, the cattle, the new seed shipment arriving late. Their conversations were not remarkable, but they mattered. Each word, each glance, was a stone laid between them, building something steady. Clara began to look forward to the sound of his boots on the steps. Not because he flattered her, he never did, but because he made space for her to be exactly as she was, with no expectation to stand taller than truth. One evening, Elias arrived early, Tommy in tow. The boy carried a box filled with pine cones and marbles, treasures only a child would value so highly. Clara welcomed them in, apron dusted with flour, cheeks flushed from the oven's heat. She handed Elias a towel to dry the snow from his gloves. "There's bread near done," she said softly. "Stay a while." Elias removed his coat, folding it carefully. "Smells like something worth staying for." Clara moved back to her work, careful but not hurried. Tommy had already set himself up in his favorite corner, humming tunelessly. Elias leaned against the doorway to the small kitchen, watching Clara shape another loaf. "You bake like you stitch," he said. "Patient, precise." She shrugged. "Flour doesn't talk back." "No," he agreed, "but it listens." She looked up at that, curious, and something passed between them. Not fire, not spark, but warmth. The kind that lives in long winters and learns how to last. Later, after the bread was out and cooling, Clara cut a slice and handed it to Tommy. The boy bit into it and gave a rare, radiant grin. Then he looked at Elias and said, "She makes bread like Ma used to." Clara froze, breath held in her chest. Elias watched his son for a long moment, then turned to Clara. "She does," he said quietly. "Only this tastes of something still here." That night, after they left, Clara sat by her window and watched snowflakes catch in the street lamp's glow. She didn't cry, she didn't need to. There was no wound, only something fragile beginning to form, like the first green blade pushing through thawed soil. 2 days later, she fell ill. It came suddenly, a fever that bloomed in her chest and stole her breath. Mrs. Goodwin found her, slumped in the chair beside the stove, skin flushed and brow damp, her bread half risen and forgotten. The doctor came. He did what he could, but he was old and weary, and his words were more comfort than cure. "She'll need care," he told Mrs. Goodwin. "Proper warmth, soft food, someone to watch the night hours." Mrs. Goodwin stayed the first night, wiping Clara's brow, whispering, "Prayers?" But the second day, when Clara still hadn't opened her eyes, she sent for Elias. He arrived before sundown. Tommy bundled in blankets, a look on Elias's face that made the floor seem suddenly smaller. He carried Clara from her chair, as if she were made of snow and music, something that would disappear if touched too hard. She murmured faint sounds but no words. Her skin was hot, her breath shallow. Mrs. Goodwin followed them to the wagon. "You'll watch her proper?" she asked, voice tight. Elias nodded once, as if she were my own. The house with the willow tree porch took her in like it had been waiting. Elias placed her in the room his wife once slept in, now fresh with new linens and a fire already kindled. He sat by her bedside as the snow fell again, lighter this time, but steady. Tommy brought her water in a chipped blue mug. He held her hand once, small fingers curled around hers, and said softly, "Don't go where Ma went." Clara stirred but did not wake. Elias watched the rise and fall of her chest through the long hours of night. He didn't sleep. He thought of her hands, always moving, sewing, kneading, offering. He thought of how she never asked for more than space, and he thought of what it meant to be strong in ways the world didn't always see. By morning, the fever began to break. Sweat covered her skin, but her breath had slowed, grown deeper. She opened her eyes just before noon and saw Elias asleep in a chair beside her bed. Tommy curled on a rug near the fire, one boot off, one still on. Her throat ached, but her heart felt strange, as if it had grown in the dark and come out blooming. "I'm not dead," she whispered. Elias stirred. "Sat up. You gave us a scare." "I'm sorry." He reached for her hand, held it like it was part of something sacred. "Don't be," he said. "Just don't do it again." She smiled faintly, eyes closing once more. By the third day she was stronger. By the fifth she could sit up and sip broth. Elias cooked what he could, plain oats, soft potatoes. Clara teased him gently, voice hoarse. "You're better with cattle than carrots." He smiled, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Cattle don't mind if I burn the stew." One evening, Tommy climbed onto the bed beside her, careful not to jostle her legs. "Papa says you're brave," he said. "I think you're like the sun." Clara looked at him, surprised. "Why the sun?" "'Cause you stayed even when it got cold." She pulled him close then, resting her cheek against his soft hair. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. That night, Elias sat beside her as the fire crackled. "You scared me," he said, "more than I've been scared in years. I didn't mean to. I know." He looked at her, eyes dark and kind. "I don't speak well," he said. "Never have. But I've been thinking what it means to be seen, to be safe, to be chosen, not in spite of something, but because of it." She watched him, breath caught between past and present. "Are you saying—" He leaned forward, took her hand again. "I'm saying I've watched you teach my son to laugh again. I've watched you fill this house with warmth, just by being in it. And I don't want to watch anymore." He paused, swallowed. "I want to build something. With you. Not because you need me, but because I need you." Silence fell between them, gentle as snow. Then Clara whispered, "I've been waiting to be chosen for who I am, not what I lack. I think maybe I stopped believing it would happen." "You never stopped hoping," she nodded, eyes wet. "That's what bread does," she said. "It rises, even when everything tries to keep it down." He leaned forward, brushed a kiss to her forehead. "Then let's rise together." She closed her eyes, let the warmth of his words settle deep. Outside, the wind had calmed. The stars were out, blinking steady and bright, and in the oven downstairs, forgotten but not ruined, a loaf of bread waited, just as she had. And now, at last, someone had come home. "You said, construct Section 4, a woman seen, a family found." With a clear, focused narrative that introduces the main characters and central conflict. Use a diverse vocabulary and ensure each sentence contributes to advancing the plot or deepening character understanding. Ensure top-notch character development. Limit the section to exact 2,000 words and avoid introducing any elements that do not serve the story's immediate needs. Structure the section to have a satisfying and thrilling end and great climax. There should be no headings. ChatGPT said, the E. Sun rose slow and full the morning Clara Bell wore her wedding dress again. This time, it wasn't out of obligation or hope unreturned. It was out of choice. A quiet, steady choice. The fabric had been cleaned, pressed, stitched with hands that knew sorrow and still believed in beauty. The lace along the collar had been re-embroidered with thread the color of wheat in late summer. She had done it herself, not out of vanity, but reverence, for what had been lost and for what had grown in its place. The house with the willow tree porch breathed a different kind of air now. It no longer creaked with emptiness or echoed with what once was. It sang in quiet ways, through the sound of firewood being stacked, Tommy's soft laughter trailing from room to room, Clara's humming in the kitchen as she measured cinnamon, with calm precision. Even Elias, with his hands worn by labor and eyes lined by past winters, moved with less weight, as if something had shifted in his chest, a looseness, like a knot finally untied. They hadn't announced the wedding with fanfare. No proclamations pinned to doors, no hurried invitations. Just a few words passed along soft voices and nods. Elias Hartwell is marrying Clara Bell. Yes, that Clara. Yes, she still uses the chair. Yes, she bakes bread like warmth tastes. No, there's no grand celebration. They're marrying at home, under the willow, and yes, everyone's welcome if they come kind. It was Tommy who carried her veil that morning. He stood beside her at the top of the garden path, one hand on her shoulder, his other gripping the hem of her lace. The child had grown, not in size, but in spirit. He walked straighter now, laughed more openly, even drew pictures of a mother, with brown hair and eyes that smiled even when the mouth did not. He had written her name across one page in careful letters, Mama Clara, and pinned it to the wall beside his bed. Clara looked up at the arch made from two willow branches bent toward one another. There were no roses, only green buds, early and eager. The world had begun its slow turn toward spring, and she felt it in her chest, a warmth, an awakening. Her hands, resting in her lap, did not shake. Her breath was deep, steady. Elias stood, beneath the arch, coat simple, hair still damp from washing. He had shaved, though not perfectly. A small nick bled just above his collar, and she smiled at that. A man preparing not to impress, but to present himself clean, as one might when walking into a sacred place. He saw her, and didn't look away. Never did. The guests, no more than 20, stood in a loose semicircle. Townsfolk who had once whispered about the girl in the chair, and now brought her warm pies and firewood. Mrs. Goodwin clutched a handkerchief in one hand and a string of pearls in the other, eyes glistening with the pride only another woman could understand. Even the pastor, normally brisk and ceremonial, read his vows with a gentleness that suited the moment, his words more poetry than sermon. Elias took Clara's hands in his, kneeling not because tradition demanded it, but because love did. He didn't ask her to stand. He met her where she was, where she had always been. "I choose you," he said, voice thick with the weight of 1,000 quiet days. "For what you've built, for how you've survived, for what you give without asking." Clara's throat tightened. Her fingers curled around his and she whispered, "And I choose you, for seeing me when no one else did." They didn't kiss right away. They sat there in the hush that followed vows, breathing in the moment like it might vanish if they moved too quickly. When it did come, it was not fiery or rushed. It was soft, full, the kind of kiss that belongs to grown souls who know what it costs to reach out and still do. Applause came gently. Laughter, too. Tommy clapped hardest, his hands smacking together like thunder. Then he ran to her, tucked himself into her lap, and beamed up at her. "You're really my mama now," he said. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "I always was." The feast afterward was simple. Stew warmed over the hearth, biscuits that flaked like clouds, cider, pressed from the last of the cellared apples. They ate in chairs pulled into the yard, coats shrugged on, cheeks pink from the lingering cold. Stories were told, old songs hummed, and somewhere amid the gathering Clara saw the seamstress's shop in town had sent a pie, pecan, wrapped in a linen napkin, no note but a hand-stitched C on the corner. She sat beside Elias under the willow, as the sun began to lean toward the horizon. He reached for her hand, not as a gesture for others, but as something necessary to himself. They watched Tommy chase a paper bird made of folded pages from Clara's sewing book, its wings catching, the wind like small miracles. "I've lived a quiet life," Elias said, breaking the silence like glass held too long in the sun. "Didn't think I'd ever wake up again." She turned to him. "Then we both lived asleep." He nodded. "But you, Clara, you made this house breathe again." "I didn't do anything magic," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "You stayed, Later, when the guests had gone and the dusk turned lavender, Clara wheeled herself to the kitchen while Elias read to Tommy by the fire. She tied her apron with fingers still flushed from the cold and began to knead dough for the morning's bread. Not because it was expected, but because it was what she did when peace settled close. The door creaked open. Elias stepped in, sleeves, rolled to the elbow. "You don't have to do that today," he said, watching her work the dough with slow, deliberate strength. "I know," she answered, "but it rises better when it starts with love." He stepped beside her, reached for the flour. "Then let's do it together." She smiled, handed him a bowl. Outside, the wind shifted. The last of the snow began to melt into the soil. Spring waited just beyond the edge of night, and in that house, under branches that no longer mourned but stretched upward with purpose, a woman who had once been left behind now baked bread beside a man who saw her as whole. A child read aloud from a book of fables, his voice carrying through the walls like the future finding its name. They were not loud people, not grand, but they were strong, and they had found one another, not through chance, but through choice. Clara would wake early the next morning and begin again. She would knead and fold and hum to herself as sunlight poured through the windows. Tommy would come in, rubbing his eyes, asking if she'd seen his favorite sock. Elias would kiss her cheek as he passed, still smelling of cedar and wood smoke. The world would not always be kind, there would still be long winters, but now she would not face them alone, because sometimes the miracle isn't in being saved, it's in being seen, and in being chosen all the same.